Welcome back to Behind the Genius, where we unlock the hidden files and forgotten truths that history tried to bury. Tonight, we're unraveling a case so strange, so unsettling, that for decades it was locked away in government archives. This is the story of the Culpeper twins, identical brothers whose existence in the late 1800s seemed to defy the natural order, a case so disturbing that America itself tried to erase them. But history has a way of whispering back, and their file has surfaced once again. In the year 1846, the town of Culpeper, Virginia was small enough that everyone knew everyone else, but just large enough that rumors could take root like ivy on the brick courthouse. Nestled between rolling hills and thickets of dark forest, Culpeper was the kind of place that clung to its routines, the tolling of the church bell at dawn, the creak of wagon wheels along muddy streets, the scent of wood smoke curling above rooftops as evening settled in. It was a quiet place, but not untouched by the superstitions of the age. Families whispered about omens and the flight of crows. They left offerings of bread at the edge of the woods to keep wandering spirits satisfied. And when a child was born with a birthmark too strange or eyes too piercing, people looked twice before offering congratulations. From the beginning, the Culpeper twins drew attention. Identical to the point of unease, they shared not only the same dark hair and pale eyes, but the same expressions, as though one soul animated two bodies. When Elias cried, Elijah cried at the same instant. When one turned his head, the other mirrored him. Eliza, exhausted but elated, saw no problem in this. To her, it was proof of a bond deeper than blood. But the neighbors muttered. Children in town were the first to notice what adults ignored. They swore that when they played with the twins, something was wrong. If one boy whispered a secret into your ear, the other, even across the yard, would laugh as though he had heard it too. If one scraped his knee, the other would wince and clutch his own leg. One little girl swore she saw Elias mouth words silently, while Elijah spoke them aloud. The two halves of a single conversation spilling into one uncanny performance. By the time the twins were 5, the town had nicknamed them the Echoes. To outsiders, the Culpepers were respectable. Thomas ran a modest farm and occasionally worked as a surveyor. Eliza was known for her generosity, often leaving baskets of food for poorer families. But within their home, unease grew. At night, Thomas sometimes woke to find both boys standing silently by the foot of his bed, their eyes wide open, their breathing synchronized. When asked what they were doing, they would only reply in unison, waiting. The Culpepers did their best to shield their sons from gossip, but in a town as small as Culpeper, protection only went so far. At Sunday service, mothers tugged their children away from the pews where the twins sat. On the schoolyard, boys dared each other to taunt the Echoes, but none dared do it twice. A slap given to one boy was felt by the other, and not just in bruises. The aggressor would swear both twins fixed him with the same cold, unblinking stare until he fled in silence. Still, it might have been nothing more than local folklore, the strange exaggerations small towns tell about unusual children, if not for what began in the autumn of 1853. That was the year when the Culpeper household started recording incidents. Thomas, practical to the bone, kept a leather-bound ledger where he noted the weather, crop yields, and expenses. Gradually, the entries shifted from farm notes to observations of his sons. The first strange entry was on September 12th. Both boys awoke screaming at the same time. Said they saw a man in the corner of their room. Room was empty. 2 weeks later, Elias cut his hand with the kitchen knife. Elijah bled at the same place, though no cut visible. By October, the entries had grown darker. Boys no longer answer questions separately, always together. They recite the same words at the same moment. Eliza says it is only imagination, but I hear them whispering at night, though their mouths do not move. Rumors spread quickly. Neighbors swore they heard chanting in the Culpeper barn at odd hours. A farmhand quit after claiming he found both boys standing in the fields at midnight, their faces tilted toward the moon, whispering in a language he could not understand. When asked about it the next morning, both denied leaving their beds. The town grew uneasy. The minister preached sermons about unnatural bonds and the dangers of the occult. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter when passing the Culpeper farm, and yet, despite whispers, despite warnings, no one could explain the most persistent and terrifying detail. The twins did not seem to age like other children. By the winter of 1855, though 9 years had passed since their birth, the twins still looked no older than 6. By 1855, the Culpeper twins had become more than just a curiosity. They were an unsettling presence in Culpeper, Virginia, a reminder of things the townsfolk could neither explain nor comfortably ignore. Their youthful faces remained unchanged, like portraits untouched by time. While other children outgrew shoes and jackets within months, Elias and Elijah seemed to wear the same clothes year after year. Their limbs lengthened slightly, yes, but at a pace so slow that even the most skeptical neighbors began to whisper. The Culpepers attempted to explain it away. Thomas insisted that the boys were simply late bloomers, pointing to a cousin who had grown tall only after 16. Eliza clung to her faith, assuring neighbors that the boys' condition was in God's hands. But behind closed doors, their reassurances faltered. At night, when the house fell silent, Thomas could sometimes hear the boys talking upstairs, not in English, not in any language he recognized, but in a low murmuring rhythm, like waves on a black shore. It was in November of that year when the family suffered their first true calamity. The Culpepers' farmhand, a man named Jonah Price, had been loyal to the family for nearly a decade. He was steady, dependable, rarely one to indulge in local gossip. One morning, however, he arrived at the farmhouse, pale and shaken. "I quit," Jonah declared flatly, refusing even to step across the threshold. Thomas tried to argue, reminding him of his wages and the harvest still uncollected, but Jonah only shook his head. His hands trembled as he explained. "The twins," he whispered. "I saw them in the fields last night, long after you'd gone to bed. They was standing there side by side, staring straight up at the sky. They was speaking something low like a chant. I thought maybe it was a prayer, but then they both looked at me. Same time, same eyes, same faces. And I swear to you, Mr. Culpeper, it weren't boys that looked back at me." With that, Jonah left, never to return. Thomas dismissed it as superstition, but unease gnawed at him. He returned to his ledger, recording the incident in careful script, as though by writing it down he could keep it contained. His entries grew increasingly frantic. December 1st, 1855, boys refused supper, sat silent at table, eyes fixed on wall. When I asked what they were looking at, both replied, "She's waiting." Asked who? No answer. December 9th, Elias burned his hand on the stove. Elijah screamed before Elias even touched the iron. Mark appeared on Elijah's skin moments later, though he had not been near the stove. December 21, both boys spoke in unison during morning prayers. Not scripture, unknown words. Eliza wept. By Christmas, the Culpepers found themselves ostracized. The church refused to let the twins participate in the nativity performance. Invitations to neighbors' houses dried up. Even the local physician, when asked about the boys' unchanging appearance, muttered something about unnatural constitutions and avoided further visits. But what most disturbed Thomas and Eliza was not the rejection of the town, nor even the strange injuries shared between their sons. It was what the boys themselves began to say. One bitter January morning, Eliza entered their room to find both boys sitting upright in bed, staring at the frost-covered window. She asked what they were looking at. In the same flat tone they answered, "The river." "There's no river here, loves," Eliza said gently, brushing back their hair. Both turned their heads slowly to face her. "Not yet." The phrase haunted her. Not yet. As weeks passed, such answers became more frequent. When Thomas asked them about their future, they would say, "We will not leave." When asked about friends, they would reply, "They are gone." Once, when pressed about who she was, the figure they often mentioned, in their nocturnal conversations, both simply said, "She is coming." Eliza confided in Thomas one evening after the boys had gone to bed. "They speak as though they know what's to come," she whispered, wringing her hands by the fire, "as though they've seen it already." Thomas, ever the rationalist, tried to dismiss it. "Children have fancies," he muttered. Perhaps they overhear too much talk in town. But he too had begun to dread the way the twins' voices harmonized, each word perfectly synchronized, like a choir rehearsed for years. He too had noticed how their reflections in the windows sometimes did not quite match, how Elijah's lips would move a half-second before Elias's in the glass, though in the room they spoke in unison. By the spring of 1856, Culpeper was a town divided. Some whispered that the twins were touched by the devil. Others suggested they were blessed, angels in mortal form. A few, mostly the older folk who still remembered old-world tales, believed. The twins were something else entirely, a crossing, a thin place, a doorway. The Culpepers themselves no longer knew what to believe. One stormy night in March, Thomas awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Grabbing a lantern, he crept toward the boys' room. The door was ajar, and as he pushed it open, he froze. The twins were not in bed. Instead, they stood in the center of the room, facing each other, hands clasped tightly. Their eyes were shut, yet their mouths moved, whispering in that same inhuman cadence. The air felt charged, the way it does before lightning strikes. For a moment, Thomas swore he saw shadows moving along the walls, not cast by the lantern, but independent of it, slithering across the plaster like living things. "Elijah! Elias!" he barked. The boys stopped instantly. Their eyes opened, wide and pale, reflecting the lantern light like glass. And then, as one, they turned their heads toward him and said in calm, chilling voices, "You should not have seen." The ledger entry from that night was short, almost frantic, the ink smudged as though written. With a trembling hand, March 19, 1856, boys awake in night. Speaking together, shadows on wall. "I fear them. God forgive me, but I fear my own sons." By early summer of 1856, the Culpepers' home had grown quieter, as though sound itself refused to linger. Neighbors rarely visited. The church bells still rang. Wagons still rattled along the dirt road, but inside the farmhouse, every creak of timber and every whisper of wind seemed amplified. Thomas and Eliza spoke less at the table. The twins, when they did speak, only unsettled them further. On June 11th, the family gathered for supper. The smell of stewed venison and cornbread filled the kitchen. Eliza bowed her head, leading the prayer. When she lifted her eyes, she found both boys staring at her with identical stillness. "What is it?" she asked softly. Elias blinked once, Elijah not at all. Together their voices rose, calm, measured, deliberate. "This is the last meal." Thomas slammed his hand on the table. "Enough of this," he roared, his voice echoing through the beams. "You are boys, not prophets, not demons. Boys, do you hear me?" The twins did not flinch. Their gazes shifted to the far wall, where a framed photograph of Eliza's late parents hung. Slowly, as though following an unseen command, they said in unison, "They're already waiting." The photograph rattled against the wall. That night, the storm came. Rain lashed against the farmhouse roof. Thunder cracked like gunfire, and the air felt thick, suffocating. Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Lee Hay rose, lantern in hand, and pushed open their door. At first glance, the room was empty. The beds were made. The window stood open, curtains whipping in the wind. Panic seized him. He rushed forward, lantern light spilling across the floorboards. There, faint footprints, muddy, trailing out the window and onto the roof. "Eliza!" he shouted. His wife hurried in, her nightdress clutched at the throat. When she saw the empty beds, she let out a strangled cry. They followed the prints out onto the roof, rain soaking their nightclothes. Lightning illuminated the world in violent bursts. And there, on the very peak of the roof, the twins stood hand in hand, eyes fixed on the storm. Their mouths moved, but their voices were swallowed by the thunder. "Elijah! Elias, get down!" Thomas bellowed, slipping on the shingles. Neither boy turned. Instead, in eerie synchrony, both slowly raised their free hands and pointed into the darkness beyond the trees. Lightning struck again, and for the briefest instant, Thomas saw it, a shape at the tree line. Not a person, not an animal. Tall, indistinct, featureless, as though made of the storm itself. Then the twins spoke, voices carrying even over the thunder, "She has arrived." The lightning died. The shape was gone. When Thomas and Eliza scrambled forward, dragging the boys inside. They found their son's hands freezing cold, though their skin was untouched by rain. Thomas's ledger entry the next morning read, June 12, 1856. The storm was not just weather. The boys know more than they should. We are no longer alone. In the weeks that followed the storm, Culpeper itself seemed to shift. The townspeople claimed the air felt heavier, as though a thunderhead lingered perpetually above the hills. Crops wilted too early. Livestock balked at leaving their pens, and everywhere the twins went, whispers followed. The Culpepers tried to carry on. Thomas worked the fields, Eliza kept the home. But no one could ignore the way the boys behaved. They no longer played as other children did. Instead, they wandered the fields at dusk, side by side, their small hands clasped, staring at the horizon as though waiting for something. Sometimes they sang songs no one recognized, soft, lilting melodies, with no words, rising and falling in patterns that left listeners uneasy, as though the music itself had been borrowed from another world. By midsummer, the townsfolk began to keep their distance. One evening at church, the minister paused mid-sermon when he noticed Elias and Elijah watching him from the back pew. Their eyes never wavered, and though their lips did not move, the minister swore. He heard them whisper his own words a heartbeat before he spoke them aloud. He dismissed the congregation early that day, and later warned Thomas and Eliza to seek God's counsel, though his tone suggested he believed God had already turned his face away. Then came the incident at the schoolhouse. Miss Margaret Flynn, the young teacher newly arrived from Richmond, was determined not to indulge local superstitions. Children are children, she told the other mothers. Twins may be unusual, but they are no devils. She placed the boys in her class, sitting them in the front row where she could keep an eye on them. For 2 weeks, lessons proceeded without event. Then, one morning, Margaret asked the children to recite the alphabet. Each child spoke in turn, A, B, C. When it came to Elias, he stood and calmly began reciting, not the alphabet, but an endless string of dates, spoken with perfect clarity. March 14, 1832, December 2, 1799. August 8, 1804, Margaret froze. These were not random numbers. They were death dates, the very same ones carved into the headstones of the churchyard cemetery. Before she could stop him, Elijah rose and joined in, continuing the list, seamlessly, as though one voice had merely handed the task to the other. Every child in the room fell silent, the sound of those death dates chilling in its precision. Margaret rushed forward, grasping the boy's shoulders. "Enough," she cried. "Stop this nonsense." Both twins turned their heads toward her in perfect unison. Their eyes, usually pale blue, seemed almost colorless in the morning light. Then, together, they whispered, "Yours is not yet written." Margaret fled the classroom, trembling. By the week's end, she had resigned, boarding the next coach out of Culpeper. From that day forward, no teacher dared instruct the twins. No child dared sit near them, and the town, once merely suspicious, began to fear openly. Thomas noted in his ledger, "They do not belong among us. I fear they never did." The Culpeper farmhouse stood at the edge of town, a respectable 2-story frame home that had once felt like a sanctuary. By the late summer of 1856, however, it had become a place avoided even by friends. Visitors stopped calling. The pastor ceased his weekly check-ins. When Eliza went into town for provisions, the grocer handed her parcels with eyes downcast, as though meeting her gaze might carry some unseen cost. Still, she tried to hold the family together. Each morning she prepared breakfast, laid out chores, and pretended her household was no different from any other. Yet nothing about her sons allowed such illusions to survive. They spoke less often now, but when they did, their words cut deeper. Their predictions were no longer vague or poetic. They were specific. Names, dates, places. On August 21st, Elias announced at the breakfast table, "A fire will take the mill at night." Thomas barked at him to hold his tongue. "You'll bring shame on this family with such talk," he growled. But that very night, as the town slept, the mill's upper floor caught fire. The flames devoured the structure before buckets of water could contain them. The cause was never determined. The next morning, the townsfolk whispered the twins' names with dread certainty. A week later, Elijah spoke calmly to Eliza as she tucked him into bed. "Mrs. Whitcomb will not wake tomorrow." Eliza shushed him, brushing back his hair with trembling fingers. But in the gray hours of dawn, word spread that their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitcomb, had indeed passed in her sleep. Rumor became accusation. The townsfolk began meeting in hushed gatherings outside the church, debating whether the Culpeper twins were cursed, or worse, whether Thomas and Eliza had struck some bargain with forces unholy. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the boys passed. Men crossed themselves as though warding off plague. Thomas, stubborn and proud, refused to leave. "This is my land," he told Eliza. "These are my sons. If the town wishes to turn its back, so be it." Yet even he, in the privacy of his ledger, confessed doubt. His entries grew darker, his handwriting jagged and uneven. "I no longer know if they are mine. The blood in them is not the blood in me. I dream of their voices in the night before they speak aloud. I wake already knowing what they will say." Then came the harvest fair, a day meant for relief, for laughter, for a fleeting escape from the burdens of farm life. Tents were raised, pies baked, fiddlers tuned their instruments. The entire town gathered on the green. Even the Culpepers, though whispered against, could not be entirely excluded. The twins walked hand in hand through the crowd, pale faces expressionless. The laughter around them dimmed wherever they passed. At the pie stand, a farmer named Joseph Crandall sneered loudly, two little crows blackening the feast. His wife tugged at his sleeve, urging silence, but Joseph would not relent. He bent down to the twins, voice sharp with mockery. "Tell me, boys, when shall I meet my end? Come now, prophets, amuse the crowd." The twins stared at him. A hush spread, as though the fair itself leaned closer to listen. Elias's lips parted first, before the moon rises. The laughter returned, louder now, tinged with nervousness. Joseph straightened, scoffing, "Fools, I'll drink a toast at sunset and prove you wrong." But as the day waned and the sun began to dip, Joseph Crandall climbed atop a wagon to hoist his jug of cider high. He opened his mouth to speak, and before a sound could escape, his chest seized. His eyes bulged, his face went pale. He collapsed onto the wagon boards, dead before he struck the ground. A scream cut the air. The crowd scattered, shouts rising into chaos. Some cried for the doctor, others cried for the minister, but most turned their eyes to the twins, who stood unmoving in the churn of bodies, their pale faces serene, their joined hands steady. By nightfall, the fair was deserted. The fiddles lay silent. Only whispers moved through Culpeper, whispers that carried to every doorway and every hearth. The twins were not children. The twins were an omen. Back in the farmhouse, Eliza wept in silence while Thomas wrote by candlelight, his trembling hand pressing the words deep into the paper. "This will not remain hidden. Already the town is changing. Already the boys know too much. What they are, I fear America will never allow itself to remember." Thus began the file that decades later would be sealed, hidden, and nearly erased from history. The Culpeper twins, a name few dared speak aloud, had marked their town forever, and this was only the beginning. By autumn of 1856, the whispers about the Culpeper twins had grown louder than the fields themselves. What had begun as hushed gossip among neighbors spread outward, carried by travelers who passed through town and by merchants who had seen the boys' unsettling presence at the fair. Word reached not just nearby farms, but towns across Virginia, then further still, until eventually it crossed the desk of a government clerk in Washington. In those years, Washington kept loose but wary watch on oddities reported in rural America. The young nation was wary of anything that might unsettle its carefully crafted image of progress and stability. The tales of two children who spoke of deaths before they occurred, who recited the names of the buried, and who left fear in their wake, could not be ignored, not when papers already brimmed with stories of seances, spirit photography, and whispers of a world beyond. It was the Reverend Silas Greer, however, who came first, a tall, gaunt man with stern features and eyes that seemed never to soften. Greer had spent years as a traveling minister, casting out corruption of the devil wherever he claimed to find it. When the news of the Culpeper boys reached his ears, he rode 3 days through storm and mud to stand at the gates of the town. His arrival was not welcomed warmly. The townsfolk, though fearful of the twins, were also fearful of what Greer's presence implied, that their small community might soon become a stage for forces they could not contain. But fear drove them to lead him to Thomas and Eliza's farmhouse all the same. Greer found the boys sitting together on the front steps, silent as the fields rustled behind them. He introduced himself with authority, but neither child lifted his gaze. Finally, Elias whispered, without looking up, "You came too late." Greer stiffened. "Too late for what, boy?" Elijah answered this time, his voice calm as though he were reciting scripture, "For the woman at the inn. She is already gone." The Reverend blinked, unnerved despite himself. He had, in fact, passed through the Culpeper Inn not an hour earlier, where the innkeeper's wife had taken ill. Still, he dismissed their words as manipulation, tricks designed to feed superstition. Yet, when he returned to the inn later that evening, he found the innkeeper wailing over his wife's still body, taken by a sudden violent seizure. Greer did not sleep that night. By morning, he had resolved to send word to Washington. Whatever these children were, frauds, demons, or something yet unnamed, they were beyond the scope of a lone minister. He sealed a letter, stamped it with urgency, and delivered it to a rider bound north. The town waited uneasily for what might follow, and in the farmhouse, Thomas wrote his fears into his ledger once more. "They will not be left to us much longer. The world has caught their scent." The letter Reverend Greer had sent to Washington reached its destination within weeks, and though most reports of unnatural children were ignored or quietly shelved, this one caught the attention of a man named Edmund Klene. Klene worked not as a politician but as a quiet functionary for the Department of War, the kind of clerk whose job was to read the margins of society, to sift through whispers that might point to dangers unknown. In those years, America was still haunted by the Civil War yet to come, its fractures already showing. Leaders worried not only about rebellion but about superstition, hysteria, and anything that could weaken public order. So when Klene read Greer's words, "Children who foretell death, whose very presence unsettles whole towns," he did not laugh. He marked the file, sealed it, and within a month he was on horseback, riding south into Virginia with 2 assistants. When he arrived in Culpeper, the townsfolk met him with wary relief. They gathered around his carriage, telling half-whispered stories of the fair, the fire at the mill, the death of Mrs. Whitcomb. Their voices trembled with a mixture of awe and fear. Klene listened, took notes, and asked only one question over and over. Did anyone see the boys act first, or did the death follow their words? Most swore the boys merely spoke, and then fate followed. Others, more fearful, insisted the twins had caused each event with their whispers. Klene made no judgment aloud. Instead, he asked to see the children directly. Klene cleared his throat. "I am here to learn about you." "Nothing more." Neither answered. The silence stretched until at last Elias looked up and said, almost gently, "You already know how your mother will die." The words struck like a stone. Klene froze, his composure cracking just slightly. His mother had been ill for months, a fact he had told no one outside Washington. The assistants shifted uncomfortably, crossing themselves. Klene closed his notebook with deliberate calm. "We'll need to arrange a more formal interview," he said, though his voice was tight. That night, back at the inn, he began his first official entry on what would later be called File 23C, the Culpeper twins. The accounts cannot be dismissed. The boys do not guess, they know. Whether trick, curse, or natural phenomenon, it demands containment. I will recommend transfer. And with that, the fate of the Culpeper twins was no longer in the hands of their family, or even their town. Winter crept into Culpeper with brittle winds and fields crusted in frost. By then, Edmund Klene's letters to Washington had grown urgent, his language sharper with every report. "Delay is dangerous," he wrote. "The longer these boys remain uncontained, the greater the risk of hysteria." His recommendation was clear. The twins must be taken. The order came sealed, with the War Department's insignia. It gave Klene full authority to remove Elias and Elijah Culpeper from their parents' custody for the purposes of study, security, and the preservation of public order to the townsfolk. It was the end of whispers. To the family, it was the end of everything. The officials arrived at the farmhouse at dawn. The air was so cold that breath rose like smoke as the men dismounted, their boots crunching on frozen ground. Eliza Culpeper met them at the door, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She clutched Elias to her side while Elijah stood quietly at the threshold, as if waiting for something he already knew was inevitable. Thomas argued, his voice raw, demanding to see the warrant, cursing the intrusion. But the paper was real, its words heavy with the full weight of Washington's authority. His anger broke into despair as two men stepped forward, gently but firmly separating the boys from their mother's grip. "They are only children," she cried, but her words fell into the cold morning like stones into a well. The twins did not resist. They walked calmly between the officials, silent as shadows. Only once did Elias glance back at his parents. His lips barely moved, but Thomas swore later he heard the words as if whispered in his own ear. "This is not the first time." No one understood what he meant. The carriage doors shut with a final thud. Wheels groaned against the frozen road as the horses pulled forward, carrying the boys away from the only home they had ever known. From that moment, the Culpeper twins no longer belonged to their family nor their town. They belonged to the file. The carriage that carried Elias and Elijah traveled for days, through Virginia's frozen valleys, across rail lines and muddy roads, until at last it reached a stone building that bore no sign. Officially, it was a military hospital, though no soldier had ever lain in its beds. Inside, it served a different purpose: to hold what the government did not wish the public to see. The boys were led into a narrow chamber lit by gas lamps. A physician stood waiting with his instruments, calipers, notebooks, strange devices of brass and glass. Beside him, Edmund Klene observed with his familiar composure, though the lines around his eyes deepened when the twins entered. The examination began with routine measures: height, weight, reflexes. Yet every test was haunted by something unspoken. When a physician pricked Elias's finger for blood, Elijah winced as though his own skin had been cut. When Elijah was asked to recite numbers backward, Elias answered first, in perfect unison. The doctors pressed harder. They asked the boys about visions, about voices. Elias remained silent, but Elijah whispered, "The walls remember." "What do you mean?" a doctor demanded. He did not answer. Instead, Elias lifted his gaze to Klene and spoke with calm certainty. "Your mother passed 3 days ago. You knew it before you left, but you would not say it aloud." Klein's face hardened. He had received the telegram that morning, folded into his coat pocket, unread by any other soul. The room chilled. The doctors muttered, debating fraud, telepathy, or trickery. But no one could explain how the children knew what they knew. The days that followed blurred into endless questions. The twins rarely spoke, and when they did, their words carried a weight that silenced the room. They described accidents before they occurred, named strangers who would die in their sleep, even recounted secrets no child could know. Each time, Klene wrote carefully, his pen scratching into the ledger of File 23C. By spring of 1857, pressure from Washington grew unbearable. Senators demanded answers. The War Department wanted results, proof that the Culpeper case was either a hoax or a discovery worth containing. Klene, torn between duty and dread, recommended one final step: separation. Perhaps, he reasoned, the twins' abilities fed on their bond. If parted, maybe the phenomenon would weaken. The order was approved. On a rain-slick morning, guards entered the chamber. One reached for Elias, another for Elijah. For the first time, the boys resisted, their hands clutched together with desperate strength, their voices rising in eerie unison. "If you divide us, you divide yourselves." The guards pulled harder. The boys screamed, but not in pain, in something deeper, a sound that shook the lamps along the walls. The gaslight flickered, instruments shattered. A clock stopped mid-tick, and then silence. When the guards looked down, the twins were gone. Their hands had slipped free, not broken apart, but vanished entirely, leaving only damp imprints on the floor. The chamber filled with chaos. Men shouted, searched, tore through every corridor. The grounds were scoured for days, the surrounding hills for weeks. No trace was found. The file swelled with testimony, denials, and theories, but it ended with a single line penned in Klene's sharp hand: The Culpeper twins are no longer in custody. No evidence of escape, no bodies recovered. Case unresolved, and with that, File 23C was sealed. Its pages, yellowing with age, were buried in the archives where few dared to read. The town of Culpeper fell silent, its people unwilling to speak of the boys again. But sometimes, when winter winds cut across the hills, old families swear. They hear two voices in unison, whispering of deaths yet to come. And though America tried to forget them, the file remains. And so the record ends, not with answers, but with silence. The Culpeper twins were taken under federal authority, examined like specimens, and then simply gone. No graves, no witnesses, no explanation. Only the file, buried deep in the archives, as if America itself wished to erase their existence. But history has a way of resisting erasure. Their story whispers still, in the old houses of Virginia, in the pages of sealed reports, and perhaps in the quiet moments when two voices rise together from nowhere at all. The question remains, were Elias and Elijah Culpeper a glimpse into something beyond human understanding? Or were they the victims of a government too afraid of what it could not control? The file refuses to tell us. And maybe that's what makes it most terrifying of all. If this story unsettled you, there are more like it waiting in the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe to Behind the Genius. It's your support that motivates me to keep digging into the files America tried to forget and to uncover stories most would rather leave buried. Hit that like button, share this with someone who craves the strange corners of history, and subscribe if you haven't already. Every click, every comment reminds me to keep going, to keep opening these lost cases and giving them a voice once again. Because the past is never as quiet as we think.